Okay, so welcome to the Mexican Cultural Institute, and I'm happy to see a lot of colleagues here. This is our second session for the series Age of Revolutions, and we're going to focus today on Mexico and the United States during the Age of Revolutions. And I just wanted to mention before going into the conversation that putting together this virtual panel mixed in with in-person public and some presenters who were in person has been a very difficult task. So I would like to thank the Mexican Cultural Institute's team and the embassy's team, Samuel and Luis, who were very supportive with all this setup, and also Angel and Pilar and the rest of the team who have been very helpful putting all of this together. So I wanted to talk a little bit first about what's next for the next days. So tomorrow we're going to have the next session, which is going to be Independence in U.S. and Mexican Historical Memory, and we will have Professors Manuel Cuéllar and Professor Mauricio Tenorio talking about questions of historical memory and how over time historical celebrations of the Bicentenario have taken place and different interpretations throughout the centuries. And it'll be moderated by Julia Young, who's our in-person professor from the Catholic University of America, who's here. So you're free to come. We would love to see you here. And then on Monday, we're going to have a morning session with the Instituto de Investigaciones Históricas, coordinated by the new director, Dr. Elisa Speckman. She's put together with Ana Carolina Ibarra many talks about the revolution, and it's called 1821, Proyecciones de una historia entrelazada. And that's going to be a completely virtual session, so please feel free to join. So today we're here to talk about questions of the United States and Mexico during the Age of Revolutions. And here we're going to talk about several aspects that we put together here. And we will be exploring the long-lasting impact of the 1821 Mexican Proclamation of Independence for the North American hemisphere, and answering a couple of questions. How did the United States live through this very turbulent period, and also Mexico through this very turbulent period, and how has this influenced and shaped our continuing relations between Mexico and the United States? What were the consequences? And we will mostly focus on Mexico-US relations during this period, which we will specify in the conversation. Latin American influences on popular understandings of race, republicanism, and different ideologies in the United States. And finally, we will talk in a broader sense and focus on questions of public history, cultural diplomacy, national history, and public reckoning, which is, I think, a very important aspect that's happening right now, both in Mexico, the United States, and in many other countries. So first of all, I would like to introduce two of our panelists here, who are wonderful historians, Professor Erika Pani and Professor Caitlin Fitz. Professor Erika Pani is from the Colegio México, and she received her PhD in history from El Colegio México and holds a post there as a lecturer and researcher. She writes and teaches on the political history of Mexico and the United States during the 19th century. And she is a member of the Sistema Nacional de Investigadores and was the director of the Centro de Estudios Históricos of the Colegio México from 2013 to 2020. Her publications include El Imaginario Político y los Imperialistas, Para pertenecer a la gran familia mexicana, Procesos de naturalización en el siglo XIX, and Historia mínima de Estados Unidos de América. And she has also co-edited with Guillermo Palacios El Poder y la Sangre, Guerra, Estado y Nación en la década de 1860, and Conservadurismo y Derechas en la Historia de México. She has also been a visiting scholar at Yale University, Harvard University, the Edmundo Gorman Visiting Scholar at Columbia University, and Tinker Visiting Professor at the University of Chicago. So welcome, Erika. We're happy to have you here virtually in this very Black Mirror-y situation. But and then we have Caitlin Fitz, who's Associate Professor of History at Northwestern University, and she received her PhD in History at Yale University. Fitz is a historian of early America in a broad and hemispheric sense. Her work explores early US engagement with foreign communities and cultures, as well as the relationship between ordinary people and formal politics. Her award-winning first book, Our Sister Republics, The United States in an Age of American Revolutions, I think it's very timely for the talk, and a lot of that book has influenced the session here. So we have several books here that have been published about several journal articles that have been published by her on the hemispheric dimensions of the War of 1812, US citizens in insurgent Brazil, Iroquois communities during the US Revolution, and anti-slavery activists in Tennessee. And Fitz has written essays, reviews, and opinion pieces for the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and the Los Angeles Times. She has held fellowships from the Fulbright Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So welcome, Caitlin Fitz, and we're very happy to have both of you here. And Casey and I decided when we were putting together the panel that it would be very interesting to have Mexican scholar who has studied US-Mexican relations and US history, and a US scholar of early America who has studied the relationship of early America with Latin American countries and Mexico. So today we're going to talk, and I wanted maybe to ask a couple of introductory questions, very basic ones, like what happened during this period? How can we make sense of this very complicated age that we're talking about? And I wanted to start with Caitlin, talk maybe in broad stroke narratives of what this period is and how can we make sense for a public who's interested in history, but how can we make this into a story that's understandable and like resonates with the present time? So Erika, I'll pass on the speaker view to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Marcel, for the introduction, and thanks to everybody who worked to make this hybrid event possible. And hi to everybody who's in person and joining virtually. I thought I would approach that question by kind of sketching out a few bird's eye comparisons between, I guess, what we in the US kind of imperiously call the American Revolution and Mexican independence and Latin American independence more broadly. So, I mean, one point of comparison that we could draw would be the scale, because the crisis that the British Empire faced in the 1770s was on a smaller territorial scale than what Spain faced in the 1810s and 20s, because Britain's insurgent colonies were like this one little strip on one section of Eastern North America's coastline. Whereas if you think, fast forward to Spanish America's, Mexico's independence wars, it's 10 times the territory. So it's a different scale if you think about Spanish America's imperial crisis. And for that matter, we often think about the 13 colonies, but we forget that that was just half of Britain's American empire in the 1770s, because Britain also had other colonies by this point in Canada and especially in the Caribbean. And the revolutionaries tried really hard to get Canada and the British Caribbean to join in this independence war, but for a variety of cultural and often economic reasons in the Caribbean, especially related to their sugar and slave economies, they don't join the revolution. So we have to remember this is just a piece of Britain's American empire. So Spanish American independence happening across more territory. And of course, Mexico is a key part of that process. So that's one piece of context to keep in mind. A second piece of context relates to foreign support, because of course, in the American Revolution, the revolutionaries get decisive support from Spain and France and from the Dutch. Whereas if you fast forward 4 decades or so, Mexico does not get that same kind of assistance on anything like the same terms. The US never does for Mexico or for Latin America what France had done for the United States. Haiti does give key support to Simón Bolívar and to Venezuela at a kind of key moment, but Haiti didn't have the economic and kind of military clout that Europe did. And so in the end, what that means is that Mexicans and other Spanish Americans have to take out big loans on unfavorable terms, and they kind of have to, they spend a lot more money essentially, which means it's a double whammy, because it means it's hard for them to buy enough guns and supplies to decisively and quickly win. So the wars stretch on. And then when they do secure independence, they have these bigger loans to pay back on less favorable terms. So the US is really lucky that it has its independence war in this moment where they can get foreign support. Why? Because Britain was so powerful in the 1770s that all these other European powers were very happy to jump in and sort of dent Britain's power by joining the war with the United States. So it's not about like the righteousness of the revolutionaries' cause or their savvy at diplomacy. It's about like the chance of global geopolitics at that moment. And then really quickly, a third point of comparison that I think is really interesting to think about is that the US entered the world economy at a kind of more fortuitous moment for global and Atlantic trade, because by the 1790s, the US economy is really benefiting by selling food and other stuff to Europe, which is in the midst of the wars of the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars. The US was this big neutral supplier, whereas Mexican independence happened at the tail end of this period of European warfare. And then after 1815, when Europe's more at peace. So they don't have this moment to be the neutral supplier of Europe and Europe's Caribbean colonies. So if anything, the reverse is happening, where Europe in peacetime and eventually by this point, the United States are flooding Mexico with stuff. And so the sort of economic challenges that Mexico faces right after independence are higher. So if you kind of combine all these factors, I think what Mexicans had to accomplish was in that sense, quite a bit trickier actually. So I'll maybe leave it at that. And Erica, I don't know if you want to add or if we want to move on.
Yeah, maybe. So thank you. I think those 3 points of comparison are very interesting, and it will definitely set the conversation moving forward. So Erica, I wanted to ask you on the Mexican side, how can we understand this relationship of the, what should we know about this broader process that's happening on the Mexican side during independence vis-a-vis the United States?
Thank you, Marcel, for inviting me to join this very interesting conversation. And thank you to the Institute and the Embassy and John Hopkins and everyone that's made this possible. And I think that what this bird's eye view that Caitlin presents shows us a very turbulent world, but also a very interconnected world. And that is the this Atlantic, which on both sides between 1776 and the 1830s is going to be bubbling with people, ideas, new ways of thinking about legitimate government, et cetera, which is going to shape these, not only the continent, but the Atlantic world. And I think that maybe I can give you paint with very broad strokes. I know that my colleagues yesterday did a wonderful job talking about the moment of independence, but just New Spain goes from, well, New Spain, like the rest of Spanish America, the crisis of the Catholic monarchy, which starts with Napoleon, who is both a product and a reaction against the French Revolution, which is, as we know, deeply connected with the American Revolution. Under the banner of defending the king and defending the king's sovereignty, we are going to have a war, which is in many ways a civil war that's going to last for 10 years, in which we have some neo-Spanish subjects who want to defend the status quo, some neo-Spanish subjects who want to break away from the metropolis, which is now polluted, which is now Frenchified, and which will evolve into this idea of creating an America that is separate from old Spain, which I think we can see even in the 1820s with this idea of having an American system, an American party that looks to the U.S. and looks to the U.S. as a possible ally, and has this men like Doyle Poinsett, who was the first U.S. minister to Mexico, kind of brokering this relationship, and then a bunch of people who really want to work maybe a different, more advantageous place for New Spain within the empire, and how in the context of war, in the context of constitutional politics on a transatlantic scale, in the context of the restoration of Fernando VII and absolutism, this will eventually lead to the ones that started the idea of separating from the metropolis, wanting to carry on independence. No, the epitome of this is Agustín de Iturbide, the royalist officer, cruel foe of the insurgents, who will negotiate with both his fellow officers, the church hierarchy, and the insurgents to gain independence, but gain independence, an independence that is based on consensus, that is based on negotiation, and then is based on the mutual recognition of both Madrid and America, that America is now ready. It's like the daughter that is finally an adult and can say goodbye to the mother, and it's an independence that is done by treaty. Also, I think that shows us also that the independence of New Spain takes place in a context where different things have been tried to break off the colonial relationship. And this idea of trying to start independent life with the approval of the mother country, with the recognition of the rights of all of those who live in America, be they of European, American, or African or Asian origins. And I think that this starts off throughout the continent, because the US also participates, and the British and the Northern British colonies participate in this transformation of the continent into a laboratory for politics of all kinds, constitutional, republican, with great enthusiasm and breadth, but also some sort of constitutional monarchy in the case of Mexico, short-lived, in the case of Brazil, in the case of Haiti. So it's the Age of Revolution also generates a revolutionary legacy that I think shapes much of the politics in the 19th century.
Thank you, Rick. I think that's a great point, which was also talked about last session, about how this hemisphere becomes a laboratory for different constitutional experiments, but monarchical experiments. And what there seems to be here is a moment when the hemisphere with all these laboratories also becomes a foundational moment. So I wanted to maybe step back a couple of moments here and talk about what is this founding moment in the US national history, And when did it become a foundational moment? And for Mexico too. So I was wondering if we could start with you, Caitlin, about this, the idea of a founding moment. How valid is this? How can we make sense of this chaos all of a sudden becoming a founding moment of experimentation? And how has this been taught in terms of public history? And how has this changed over time?
Yeah, I mean, it's such a great question. I think these sort of founding moments and anniversaries, one reason that we have them is simply that it's useful to do so because it gives us an opportunity or an invitation to reckon with our past, to highlight important themes that are of particular relevance to us today. But I think anniversaries can sometimes also be a little deceptive if they convey that a founding is something that happens just in the snap of a finger or the signing of a document, because a founding is really a whole process. It happens over years. And so in the US, like when your question is like, what is a founding moment for the United States? So this has, of course, been a big debate about, is it 1619 with the first arrival of enslaved Africans in British North America? Is it the Declaration of Independence in 1776? Is it the peace treaty with Britain in 1783? The Constitution? Is it the Bill of Rights? Is it the treaty at the end of the War of 1812, the so-called Second U.S. War for Independence? And other historians have said that we can think of the Civil War and Reconstruction as itself a second founding moment, because it so transforms the meaning of the US Constitution and of US law. So I think all of these are founding moments, and they're more than the sum of their parts. They build on each other. I think if we talk about one founding moment, we miss the way in which the nation itself changes over time. The way in which, like, the nation that the signers of the Declaration envisioned was a really different kind of nation than what you see envisioned in the Constitution, which is itself really different from the Constitution that comes out of Reconstruction. And I think the reason it matters is that it's important as a question of public memory, not to think of a founding as something that's like a one-time thing set in stone that sets forward this sort of inevitable trajectory, because a democracy is, of course, it's a never-ending project. So it's not like the rights we have today were things granted to us in one moment. It's a continual process of fighting over their rights. So for me, I think it's better to think of a series of founding events in US history that basically generated and propelled an ongoing debate about who we the people are and what those rights should be. So I really think about the founding as a process. And I know you talked about like how it's sort of our understanding has changed over time, but I've talked a lot, so maybe I'll stop and let Erica jump in about the Mexican founding.
No, and one of the things we can probably add about what Caitlin said is, in the US, there is such weight put into the founding that you have not an important part of the political class who thinks things should be decided by what the founders thought and wrote, which is, when you think about it, kind of scary. But also, I think for Mexico, it's interesting that we have these two dates, 1810, 1821. And this completely, I think, counterintuitive idea, because if we think about experience, no one thinks that the day the child is born, his story is written, or his or her story is written. But we do think that the country, depending on what its founding was like, then that puts the country into one single path that it will follow. And on the other hand, I think these celebrations, commemorations are important in making us think about what does change with these processes that are so important in, shaping our history. For this age of revolutions, and this does not only happen in New Spain, Mexico, but in the hemisphere, in parts of the Atlantic world where the revolution really destroys in many ways the Ancien regime, is this revolution in the idea of nation and how the nation or the people come to occupy the center of the political stage, and the idea of sovereignty, belonging, or being rooted in these people. So it becomes an inescapable political fiction, but the story of Mexico is not written in the criollos patriotas who thought the Virgin of Guadalupe was the emblem of the nation. It's not written in Miguel Hidalgo's cry that early morning of September 16th. And it's not part of either the Plan de Iguala or the Tratados de Córdoba, because the construction of a political community is something that we have to do every day, and that I think is usually more efficient when it's done looking towards the future. What do we want to be than what have we been? How has it changed in the last, I would say that in the last 30 years, and Alfredo Avila is in the audience, so he is the expert if you want to talk to him after this event. I think that is changed profoundly, gone from an idea of a nation that has been sleeping, or a nation that was oppressed for 300 years by the Spanish colonial domination, that woke up in 1810 and finally liberated itself in 1821 and was betrayed by this monarchist called Agustín Iturbide, to understanding how an imperial crisis started the ball rolling on New Spain. Politicians in New Spain thinking, what is our place within the empire? And then how should we, what makes political power legitimate? Should we write a constitution? Do we fit into the 1812 Spanish Constitution? And eventually deciding that they didn't, and trying to build a nation on the different ideas that different groups have. And when you write a constitution, you have to get people to agree to a single document. And that's, and Mexico has 5 constitutional exercises up to 1857. So I think that shows us, that this is not one magical moment where these supernatural heroes created a nation from nothing, but a political experiment that gets started and that has different highs and lows throughout, and that is not done today.
Can I add just a quick reaction to that? Because it so resonates with me as a historian of the United States. I mean, first of all, the men who signed the Constitution themselves said, this isn't a perfect document. It's kind of the best we can do right now. We'll go change it. We'll make it better over time. So they themselves understood this to be one step, but certainly not the only step. And the idea of what the founding was really changed over time in the United States too. So if you think about the Declaration of Independence, it was at first really a geopolitical document, because until the Continental Congress declared independence, they couldn't go to Europe and ask for foreign aid. You had to first declare independence and then get aid. So it's declaring to the powers of the earth that the US is sort of open for business and will welcome aid. It wasn't seen as this sort of lofty statement of inalienable rights and self-evident truths for decades. That really comes as the revolutionary generation is dying in like the 1810s and 20s. And so it's this new generation where at July 4th parties across the country, they're sort of elevating the Declaration of Independence into a founding document. And what's so interesting is that that's precisely the moment when Latin America has its independence wars. And in fact, one of the most common things that you saw at July 4th celebrations, as the Declaration of Independence is getting elevated to new heights as a statement of, human equality, is Latin America is central to that. And so there's a lot of Americans in the US who are taking Latin American declarations of independence and Mexican independence. And that is kind of contributing to the sense in the US that declarations are part of a kind of global or at least hemispheric movement for republicanism. So I'll stop there, but just to say that I think there's a lot of parallels between that process in Mexico and in the United States.
I think that's a great comparison, and talking about declarations and also celebrations that come with those declarations that might lead us to the question of how this hemispheric history has been shaped, and what does hemispheric history even mean for all these processes that are taking place. I think one of the current concerns or questions that are floating around in terms of public history, but also cultural diplomacy, is that a lot of the California, the Southwest, and what Jordana Dim was talking about Central America, that the question of independence and dates and when should certain dates and declarations should be celebrated. Why is, for example, the Southwest and California not celebrating the Mexican independence? And here I think it leads us to the question of hemispheric history. And we've been talking about this history all along. What does it even mean when we talk about hemispheric history, and why is this important for public history and cultural diplomacy in this sense? Erika.
I think that it's public history is usually means to create community, no? So it's usually obsessed, no, with the nation. And in these efforts to create something called the national identity, and its efforts to create this idea of an history that is different from all other histories, and that makes Mexicans or Americans or Nicaraguans or what they are, which is something different from everything else, we lose sight of how interconnected these processes were. I mean, they were interconnected not only because Spanish Americans could look to a successful example of national independence and of the creation of a republic and of a federal republic. It's important because if Napoleon had not invaded Spain, then what would have happened? It's important because what Caitlin mentioned at the beginning of our talk, no? The economic context, which is so different. The US benefits from British-French rivalry, and then once it's independent, the market, that very dynamic market that is created by the Napoleonic Wars, the Spanish Empire crisis is created by the Napoleonic Wars, and then it's a very hostile environment in terms of markets and in terms of politics, because you have the Holy Alliance, which makes a lot of noise about defending monarchy and even reestablishing colonial rule in the Americas. So these connections necessarily shape the space in which these men and women who are committed to creating a new state are moving. And if we don't try to at least understand them, be aware of them, we don't understand what happened, no? And then I think for the case of Spanish America, this has the added risk of you don't understand and you think that the problem is some sort of psychological failure, Oh, so things don't work out because we are too Spanish, Catholic, Indian, mixed. We're not Republican. We have a little caudillo that lives in our heart, and that it makes us fail at state building. When the truth is that the contexts are made more difficult by these outside connections.
Caitlin, would you like to, thank you, Erika. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think Erica's right that US and Mexican histories are more interconnected than we often assume, and interconnected in ways that we might not always expect. So I think the dominant narrative is one of conflict, of violence and warfare. And that's, of course, a key part of the story, a key part of the history, but it's not the only part of the story. And so I think it's useful to also remember these points of, I guess we might call the connection or solidarity, because what's interesting is the new nations in the Americas. I mean, and this was part of the discussion yesterday, and Erika's touched on this. They're these big political experiments, and so they're all grappling with different contexts, but similar questions. Should we declare independence? If so, should we be a republic? Should we be a monarchy? Should power be centralized or dispersed to the states? Who, if anyone, should vote? Should we end slavery? And if so, how and when? And so you see these moments where when these new nations arrive at similar answers, say about declaring independence, then there's this feeling of solidarity that often emerges, like, oh, we're all sister republics, we're in this together, we can support each other, cheer each other on. And in fact, that's why I think Latin American independence gets so much popular enthusiasm in the US, because it makes people in the US feel like this global leader all of a sudden, whereas they had been on the margins of Atlantic geopolitics for decades, right? So it contributes to popular US nationalism and like sense of purpose in the world. But then there's other times when, having asked these similar sets of questions, these new nations arrive at very different answers, say about ending slavery. And so that's when some of the conflict especially emerges. That's when these nations often turn each other into foils, because they then represent to each other paths not taken, and doors closed, or, you know, who they might have been, maybe who they might become, but because they're asking the similar questions, it sort of puts pressure on when they answer differently. So I think this matters for the present day, because again, it's US-Mexican history is not just defined by the history of arriving at different answers to these questions. There's also these moments of collaboration, or in the US, there's often, in the early 19th century, a very, I mean, to me, it was surprising when I first found it, this sense of that US welfare was interwoven with what happened in Mexico and in the rest of Spanish America. So yes, there is imperialism is part of the heritage, but so is this more kind of cosmopolitan outlook that was surprisingly widespread in the early United States. And so I think good public history needs to reckon with both sides of that coin, because they come together in a lot of ways.
And if could I just add something, Marcela? I'm sorry.
Yeah, of course.
And I think that one of the things that also, by its very nature, public history tends to leave out, because it usually comes from public institutions, is that relationships between two countries, and especially relationships between two neighboring countries, are very rarely contained by diplomacy and state-to-state action. So you have a lot of, I would say, borderlanders live this love-hate, cooperation, conflict, and you have the relationship between the US and Mexico goes through so many diverse channels and is positive and negative in so many complex ways that I also think that this is something that needs to come to the fore. This is not something between Washington, D.C. and Mexico City. This is something that involves licit and illicit in exchanges, the movement of people, the movement of ideas, and some people benefit and some people don't. So there is, I think, that this very much more complex, much more diverse relationship that also needs to be taken into account. So I celebrate that public history wants to take this upon itself.
I think that's a very interesting question that both of you mentioned, the idea that this is a story of collaboration, but it's also a story of conflict. And I think here we have as a backdrop or as a context and I think part of the whole conference is the idea of an age of revolutions. And I wanted to maybe tease this term a little bit more and connect it to how it has been taught, who originally came up with the idea. We can talk about Eric Hobsbawm being the one who termed the idea of the age of revolution for Europe from the mid 18th century to the mid 19th century. But we were also, as we were preparing this talk, we mentioned other examples of how the idea of the age of revolutions eventually excluded a lot of countries, a little bit like silencing the past style of, like in the case of Haiti, or in the case of the Spanish-American revolutions. So I wanted to ask you, what does the age of revolutions mean? Why is it important? Not only just for this talk, but for current debates happening in the public, among historians. And in what sense, how has it changed over time when it's been taught at school? So maybe we could start with Caitlin.
I unmuted myself. Yeah, so I mean, when I think about the age of American revolutions, I see it as a subset of the broader age of revolutions, which would include Europe and beyond. And I think of it as starting with the United States and then crucially moving to Haiti, which declared independence in 1804 as an avowedly Black abolitionist nation. And what's key to mention there is Haiti's role in shaping global abolitionism and abolitionism, especially throughout the Americas, and human rights discourse, which is important to mention because I think often when we think about human rights and ideas about freedom, we think of them originating in the kind of North Atlantic and Europe and the US, and recent scholarship, which for a long time really left Haiti out or silenced Haiti, is now emphasizing Haiti's crucial role to human rights thinking and discourse and abolition in the US and beyond. So I think that's a really pivotal moment. And then of course, age of revolutions extends to the 1810s and 20s with Spanish America and Brazil. So I mean, that's sort of what I include when I think about it. I should also mention, although when I talk about like most of the Western Hemisphere becoming independent, I should really specify that the vast majority of the Western Hemisphere is still controlled by indigenous nations, places that Europeans had not managed to colonize even after centuries of being in the Americas. So those nations were already independent. They often do need to adjust their political and diplomatic strategies in order to negotiate with these new nations that emerge in this age of revolutions, because oftentimes these new republics seem to pose a greater threat to indigenous sovereignty than the older European empires did. So that's certainly an important piece of the story that has grown more prominent, I think, in the scholarship. And then I guess, well, maybe I'll stop there, and Erica, you can jump in, and I can talk more about how interpretations and teaching of the revolution has changed, but I'm curious what you would say.
No, I think that if we think of the classic book on democratic revolutions, leaves Spanish America completely out, not only Haiti, but also Spanish America, because it stopped in 1800, no? So you have this idea that there's this democratic tradition that is basically North Atlantic or even European and the US. So that I think we've decisively left behind, not only by taking into account the transformation of the collapse of the Atlantic empires, the transformation of a whole continent practically into a republican. I think that the point that Caitlin makes about indigenous politics and polities is very well taken. I would say that another thing which I think we have gained in the past years is to leave behind this idea in taking seriously these areas that had been kind of marginalized in the analysis of democratic revolutions, is the idea that culturally some areas are not too democratic, so that these republics were basically masks, and that the old corporate, hierarchical, etc. regimes were still working with barely, a varnish of people calling themselves republics and using democratic practices. And I think that the work of people like Marcela Ternavasio, of Hilda Sabato, Peter Guardino, et cetera, have shown us that the problem was not the lack of understanding of republicanism and democracy, but pushing the principles of popular sovereignty to sometimes the logical. I think that once we start thinking about, for instance, guerra de castas in terms of Republican warfare, and not only this, of course, there is this defense of these local communities, but the fact that they are playing on a Republican playing field, I think gives them a certain character. And the fact that they are called guerra de castas by non-indigenous makes them the violence that drives the repression of these movements, and it legitimizes this repression. So I think that by taking seriously democracy and the republic in these both within some communities and in these territories that had been marginalized, opens up a very enriching panorama, I think.
And can I add two more things that I think have been really new? And I'm curious, Erica, if there's like a parallel within Mexican historiography, but in the US, I've noticed a really striking downplaying of abstract ideology as an explanation for the revolution or for independence. And the scholarship is much more now about the concrete interests that drove revolutionaries. And so like one of the biggest interpretations of the revolution that now comes out, the US revolution, is that one key engine of the war was a feeling among white colonists that the British Empire wasn't allowing them to dispossess Native people fast enough, and that they could do so more quickly as an independent republic. And so the American Revolution, increasingly, that I think my colleagues and I teach is, yeah, it's anti-colonial in the sense that these colonists want out of the British Empire, but it's also neo-colonial in the sense that it's trying to accelerate the expansion of these white settlers. So that's one thing. But then I guess the other one where maybe there's particular overlap with Mexico is new interest in loyalists in the United States or royalists in Mexico and Spanish America more broadly. So as part of that like political experimentation that you mentioned, and for all of the sort of depth and resilience of Spanish American republicanism and US republicanism, there's also this, and I know Marcela Echeverri was, this is her big intervention, or one of them, and she's in the audience. Hi, Marcela. I think that that's really a key new development in the scholarship, to take loyalists and royalists seriously as political thinkers, and to appreciate that royalism and or loyalism was actually a really, in many cases, a logical response to the chaos and uncertainty of this revolutionary moment, and that it may have had particular appeal for racial, ethnic, or political minorities for whom rule by a majority, republicanism, or a democracy might have been especially threatening. And so I think taking royalism seriously as a kind of logical response to this period is also a new, something that I think we're paying increasing attention to.
I think two main topics have emerged out of this discussion, which is one, talking about the borderlands and the royalists and all these Native American peoples who were like sort of negotiating between these broader spaces that were in flux, leads us to the question of actors. Who are all these actors? But the other second broad topic that has come out is the question of ideologies. And so we're talking here about many different ideologies and worldviews that are, some of them competing against each other, others collaborating, and there's this back and forth through channels of different ideas and people coming back and forth. So I would like to maybe start with the questions of what are all the ideologies behind this moment of revolution in Mexico and the United States, and how did they evolve over time? And here I would like to start with Erika probably, and then move to Caitlin.
No, I agree with Caitlin that one of the things that we have gained recently is a more, I would say probably a more sophisticated approach to ideology, and the realization that ideology and interest are not two separate things that live in different doors. I'm hoping Mexican scholars will stop tripping over the whole liberalism, conservatism divide, as if this was the motor of politics, for once and all eternity. So, and to look at these, in this case, especially men, who are building the state with no recipe, with different models, and with different objectives. And they are politicians. They are interested in gaining power. They are not interested in constructing a philosophical theory of how to govern. So that, I think, makes the use of language, and I think that our colleagues who have worked on conceptual history have given us a lot of pointers on this, is strategic. It's not necessarily the reflection of these deep held beliefs that are supposed to be ideology, and that liberalism is one thing, conservatism is another. So there is, how do you resolve, they are facing real problems, how do you resolve the tension between building a center that will hold the nation together, but not only recognizing the rights of regions, but these are the regions are many times the ones that hold power in their hands. So it's not centralism is a better idea, or not. It's how do you convince them that they can, that they should, these regional elites, they're not abstract states, the regional elites, that we need a national center to hold. Who do you can't escape elections. How do you organize elections so that the country doesn't fall apart every time you have one? Who do you allow to vote and who do you keep out? This is not an easy, the context in which they are working does not allow them to do as they probably think they should. We oftentimes repeat, well, Jose Maria Luis Mora, the leading liberal of the early Republican period, wanted suffrage to be based on property. They had a hard time establishing these exclusionary systems. And on the other hand, they had indirect elections, which left, everyone could participate, very few could decide. So that, I think, has state building and the ideas on how to build the state and the nation had a lot more to do with these problem-solving efforts in a context of very divisive struggles for power, and that had much more to do with that than with ideology.
Yeah, I think I have a similarly pragmatic approach to thinking about the ideologies in this moment. I mean, like, one question, in some ways, well, one of the key questions for the early United States is, how is this little cash-strapped government in New York / Philadelphia and eventually Washington, D.C., how are they going to command the loyalties of US citizens living in, like, Kentucky or closer to Canada or closer to New Spain? I mean, one thing that's fascinating to me is that, like, in the decade after the American Revolution, New Spain and British Canada were trying to attract US citizens' loyalties, trying to convince them to come down to, Spanish Texas or Louisiana or go up to British Canada. And they're trying to entice them with lower taxes, of all things. After the American Revolution and that whole debate about taxes, Americans are paying higher taxes post-independence. So I think one way that this tiny US government, this exceedingly weak US government in many ways, that they command the loyalties of those citizens and keep them in the United States and not going off to New Spain or British Canada, although some do, is by sort of unleashing US expansion onto indigenous lands, as I mentioned earlier, right? Like, one thing this little US government can do is incentivize or kind of back up colonists or citizens now who want to move on to indigenous lands with laws and treaties and wars. So there's, like, a way in which the case for Republican government is not just coming at the level of Thomas Paine saying, this is why it's a great thing, but it's also what this government can provide to its citizens. And then I guess the other ideology that I would just mention is democracy, because I think Erica and I have both used that word in our comments. And it's interesting because the word democracy started, in this early revolutionary period, especially, or at least in the US, it's like a bad word. It's a dangerous thing. Democracy with a little d means mob rule, like tyranny of the people. And so that only changes in the United States in, like, later in the 1790s, early 19th century. And the only reason it changes is because the word democracy loses some of its teeth, it loses some of its radicalism. So it's, in a way, the concept of democracy gets tamed for the US. That's when US politicians start using the word democracy a little bit more. So I guess I would be, and maybe we can talk about this more later, like, when does the idea of democracy, like the explicit use of the term, when does that gain currency in the US and in Mexico? And why? Like, how does a concept that seems as radical to so many people in the late 18th, early 19th century, Like, at what point does that become seen as a good thing, handing more power to ordinary people?
That's a great point of the question of democracy, which we'll go back to maybe towards the end of our conversation about, especially talking about how this past informs the present relations between Mexico and the US. But I wanted to go back to the other side of the other main aspect that emerged out of the conversation of the revolutionary moment, which is, who are all of these actors? Like, who are the main characters in this story, and how has the story, as it changes, brought out different actors? Also, we want to talk about archives, how certain archives do not show certain actors, and how can we recover women, Native American actors, Black actors. How has this changed? Like, which little stories can we bring up in this very chaotic world that's taking place between Mexico and the United States, and then the whole hemisphere? Just wanted to mention there that I think it's very interesting that the question of borderlands, but also ports and the sea, are these spaces where a lot of people circulate back and forth and cross many boundaries that you would never really expect. And since you mentioned all these Native American empires, I believe this book by Becca Hamalainen called it Comanche Empires is very interesting, because it sort of tells you this story of how the raiding space of the Comanches extended from Arizona all the way sometimes to Guanajuato as this chaos starts emerging. So in this very chaotic scene, which little actors can we follow aside those, big, high rolling stakes diplomacy, like Joel Poinsett or Manuel Sosaya? We can also talk about them. How can we put them next to other actors which were equally or probably equally influential, I would say here, but maybe not as well known because of public history, because of national history, how it's changed over time? So maybe we can start with Erika.
I think we need to get rid of the heroes and the villains. And once, I still think the biographies that Carlos Herrejón wrote about Hidalgo and Morelos, fabulous, and they transform heroes into these actors that are dealing with a world shaped by violence, uncertainty, and aspirations to build a better world. And we need to look at not only the heroes and the villains, not as heroes and villains, but to look at other actors. John Tutino is in the audience, so these men and women who the men followed Hidalgo, then some of them did not come back. The women who stayed at the head of and became ranchers themselves. Silvia Marina Arrom has this wonderful biography of the Güera Rodriguez, where everything we thought we knew about this woman, thanks to Artemio del Vallariste, is basically wrong. We need to go to the archives and try to recreate the past of these men, women, and children, if possible, and not tell the story that we think is what happened. No, that it should have happened this way, so this is the story I'm telling. No, we need to go back and discover the lives of these men and women, independent, and it doesn't matter on which side of the fight they were on. We will often discover that they were kind of weaseling their way, between the two sides and trying to figure out where one should put their money to see before the outcome. ¿A qué le iban a apostar? What should they bet on? And that they had to bet on different things often.
Yeah, I like that way of framing it. They have to, people are thinking, what should they bet on? What's their best chance of survival and of keeping their family alive and themselves alive? I mean, that's one of the main drivers, what side people take. I mean, I guess I would point to the Comanches as one example of people who are shaping this. I guess I'm thinking more of the US war with Mexico in this case, and Brian DeLay and Pekka Hamalainen's arguments that Comanche raids on northern Mexico weaken northern Mexico's grip on Texas, and in a way that makes it much harder for them to fight the United States, right? So they've already started to lose their grip on northern Mexico. Mexico has lost its grip on its northern territories and states by the time the US war with Mexico starts. So that's one of the big things that kind of that facilitates US victory in 1848. So I'm getting a bit of ahead of myself, but I wanted to bring in the Comanches there. I mean, I guess the other thing I would say is that we could look a lot at anti-slavery activists and thinkers in the United States and Mexico as people who are dramatically transforming both Mexican policy and US policy, and doing it across national lines. So I'm thinking here of Alice Baumgartner's new book called South to Freedom, because although Mexican anti-slavery policies were, painstakingly, painfully piecemeal and slow, they're more than what you saw in Louisiana, for example, or Mississippi. And so I think she says she estimates maybe between 3,000 and 5,000 enslaved people from the United States fled to freedom in Mexico, and more tried. And what's fascinating is that Mexico uses that to deter US expansionism, because will US enslavers want to move close to Mexico? Will they want to move into Texas if they then have to worry that their slaves will escape to freedom across the border and never come back, which is part of why Mexico finally abolishes slavery in 1837. It's because Texas has just declared independence. And so this is Mexico's way of saying, look, US enslavers are coming at their own risk. And that doesn't just come from the leaders in Mexico City's government. That comes from pressure from below. That comes from ordinary Mexicans who are not returning fugitives, not turning them in. I mean, I'm kind of oversimplifying this story a bit, but that's a very kind of bottom-up story. And I think on the flip side, you see US abolitionists, Black as well as white, constantly referencing Mexican anti-slavery as early as the 1820s, saying, look, it is possible for a republic to end slavery. I mean, they had an overly optimistic view of what Mexico had accomplished, for sure, but nonetheless, they keep citing it as a model for the United States. And in their minds, US abolitionists kept turning to Mexico as evidence that multiracial republics were possible. And so if you look at a lot of abolitionist writings, they point to Mexico, they point to Colombia, they point to Chile as examples of the kind of government they want the United States to have. And again, that's not just because Mexican or Spanish American leaders decided this would be a good thing. This is because there was pressure on them to do that. So there's a grassroots anti-slavery pressure in Spanish America that shapes their governments, that then becomes a model for these popular activists in the United States. And I can say more about that, but I think I'll stop there because I know we have a lot of other stuff to talk about.
So we got one question from the Facebook Live, but I might connect it. It has to do with democracy, so I might connect it to one of the last questions that we have. Well, I think a very important aspect here that we've been talking about is this comparison, almost in a mirror-like situation. And here, it's a constant question of Mexico and the United States, constantly comparing to each other, and the idea of evolving illusions and myths and representations of each other. How can we talk about all these different representations of the other country and the influences that have had on each other throughout time, and especially during this period? And I think this could lead us to the question of democracy, which I would like to go back towards the end. I think one of your very important aspects of your book, Caitlin, Our Sister Republics, is that there is this constant awareness of the other and the different movements that are happening there. And what happened initially is that you talk about falling in love with the United States with all these republics to the south, but then something went sour and that reflection started changing. So I wanted maybe to tease a little bit more of that aspect of your book. And for Erika, I wanted to ask about the question of what is a declaration act. And that also brings in the idea of how these declaration acts keep on referring to each other, but they're always aware about the other having a declaration act. What does a declaration act mean? Un acta de independencia. So maybe we can start with Erika, who's in terms of I'm switching one on one. So.
No, everything I know about declaration acts I learned from Jordana Dim. So no, I think that, and one of the things that is very interesting about this period is this idea of beginning the world anew and being able to create a new entity that can, make war, negotiate peace, and sign treaties with other entities that are on the international stage by either the stroke of a pen or some other act. For Mexicans, as Mexicans, I don't think we realize how strange this thing is that we celebrate every year, the scream, no, el grito. Oh, it's El Grito de Hidalgo, and El Grito de Hidalgo made us independent. El Grito de Hidalgo, first, we are not absolutely sure of what he said, and it certainly did not make us independent. There are so many actas de independencia in Spanish America that did not give birth to an entity that was recognized by other powers as an independent nation. So again, it's one of the things that complicates this idea that there is one founding. There are a number of men who are fathers of the nation, and that they, to this congruent being that will move around with the great powers of the world. But I think that it's also very interesting to think what these actions are that the actors thought would engender the nation, no? A declaration, a treaty, an action that called forth a popular response, such as the grito. And what really gave birth to the nation? Was it recognition by other powers, which was exceedingly important? No? Just need to see the efforts that are made by the Spanish American governments to send envoys and to sign a treaty, especially with Great Britain, no? To confirm and protect their existence. Is it when the old, no? Do you become independent when the mother country finally recognizes your independence? So I think that also shows us about these processes and allows us to think about what makes an effective presence on the international stage, on the diplomatic stage.
Yeah, so as to the question of mirroring, I'll maybe put up some slides really quickly just to show some of what this looked like. Can you see the slides? Okay. So I've referenced this a few times, but here's a picture of a kind of typical July 4th celebration in the early United States. And what I found is that more than half of July 4th celebrations from 1815 to 1825 were included toasts to Latin American independence. And there are also songs in honor of Latin American independence. There are poems that sort of everyday, like ordinary Americans, men and women, write about Latin American independence. There's even Bolivar hats become this big fashion trend. It's actually an international fashion trend. I've also found Bolivar hats in England and in France. I know they were worn in Haiti. I would be surprised if they weren't worn in Mexico as well. But this is, people actually would wear them specifically to July 4th parties to showcase their patriotism, not just as citizens of the United States, but as sort of broad-minded cosmopolitans who were also rooting for Latin American independence. And you even see what I always like to call a Bolivar baby boom, where you have hundreds of parents throughout the US, even in rural areas, farmers mostly, who are naming their sons Bolivar or Bolivar, as they variously pronounced it. Now, I haven't found any baby Iturbides. I've looked for baby Iturbides. I've come up short, but I did find a baby Morelos who's born in Kentucky. And I'm pretty sure we can say that he was named after Jose Maria Morelos because, in other words, the sort of the Mexican muleteer turned priest turned revolutionary. I'm pretty sure he's the namesake because baby Morelos's namesake, his big brother was named Bolivar. So you can tell these parents in this Kentucky cabin in rural Kentucky, they are slaveholders. And yet here they are naming one son after Simon Bolivar and another son after Morelos, which is, I mean, there's all kinds of ways we could take that. But what's interesting is that this happens even though pretty much everyone in the US knows that Latin Americans were Catholic. And it's widely reported that Spanish Americans in particular are implementing these anti-slavery measures. And yet this sort of enthusiasm continues for all kinds of reasons. I guess I don't want to talk too long about this, but I think what it suggests is a certain amount of kind of universalist optimism in the US that would lead these, I mean, in many cases, these white Americans to be so, or Protestants to be so kind of to knowingly and emotionally embrace Spanish American Catholic and often, you know, vaguely or moderately anti-slavery revolutionaries. So there's this moment of where people in the US say, oh, anybody can be a good Republicanism or a good Republican. That really starts to fall apart. That thinking declines in the late 1820s, partly because of political instability in Latin America, but also partly because in the US, slavery is spreading and that kind of universalist rhetoric becomes all the more threatening. And so you see a turn away. And this is where the mirroring kind of comes again, where increasingly you see white US slaveholders use Spanish Americans as a foil to say, Spanish America, Mexico, those are dangerously anti-slavery, you know, dangerously radicalized republics in contrast to the United States, which they cast as the uniquely moderate, successful, and importantly, white republic. And so that's a shift that happens in the mid to late 1820s for all kinds of reasons. And I think that's one piece of a broader transition that explains how you get from being sister republics and this feeling of we're all in this together to the US and Mexico being at war in the 1840s. It's that sort of the rise in sort of white US exceptionalism combined with what would be by the 1830s, this growing US presence in Texas, which I'll just leave it there for now and say that's kind of one of the key transitions that my book looks at. And
just to add to that, Marcel, the US and Mexico, the US-Mexican War, loss of half of Mexico's territory, profound crisis that this unleashes upon the political class in Mexico. And still in the 1856, 1857 Congress, you have constant quotes, references to Jefferson, to the Federalists, to what Hamilton says, so there's really this idea of common aspirations, even though there is a lot of mistrust with not only with the US itself, but with the US representative in Mexico, with both John Forsyth, then McLean, then the supposed friend of Mexico, Thomas Corwin, who had protested against the war, et cetera, who is still seen as someone who is out to get more Mexican territory. So you do have this relationship that is fraught with tension, but that is central to the way Mexico behaves, no? Has to think about how it acts on the international stage, but also of how it constitutes itself.
And if I can add one quick thought, I would add to that too, that like the US war with Mexico was not inevitable. If you go back to like the presidential election in the US in 1844, where Henry Clay, who's nationally famous, has been for decades, is running against this Tennessee dark horse, James K. Polk. And the election comes down to the swing state of New York. Polk wins New York by a fraction of a percentage point, and therefore it takes the New York electoral votes, wins the election. But it's easy to imagine a scenario where, say, it rains in New York City on election day, and the largely, pro-Polk Irish immigrant base doesn't turn out because it rains. And, what if Clay had won? It's easy to imagine. Clay was very clear. He would not have annexed Texas. He didn't want to go to war with Mexico, not because, he did think it was wrong, but especially because he knew that adding this new land that US slaveholders wanted would be a political hot potato that the US wouldn't be able to handle. And so, not to say that relationship would have worked out perfectly, but Henry Clay envisioned a relationship between the US and Texas where they would be sort of trading partners. They would coexist as republics, Texas as an independent Texas in between the US and Mexico. So there are other ways we can imagine this having unfolded that look different from the US war with Mexico.
Wonderful. And I would like to bring in here last question and then open it up to the public. Well, next year, we're going to celebrate the 200 years of US-Mexico relations. And this story seems to be very important, but I wanted to ask you both and maybe open up, and you can maybe answer together with the questions that might be asked. Why is this story important to understand current US-Mexico relations, especially for an audience that's interested in history, but also in foreign relations? How can we bring in this story and try to understand what's going on right now? And maybe an even more strange question, a little bit like what Alejandro Cañeque asked yesterday. In 50 years' time, or in a long-term sense, how will historians look back at this moment, and in which ways do you think it could be interpreted as we are doing so for this period? So the other Facebook question that came up here is, would you consider loyalism and royalism managed democracy between, entre comillas? So I'll open up with that question from the Facebook, but also the one I gave. And if you have any questions, that would be great. There's the microphone there in the middle. So. Yeah, there's.
Thank you. Hello, Felix Feifla. on that last note, loyalism and royalism and the idea of the process of independence and it's in nation building, how does Maximilian and the French play into that? Because the independence that we're talking about, if I'm not mistaken, in 1810 and 1821 in Mexico is only the beginning of it. You still have the French coming down the pike and the Maximilian experience, shall we say, and which also then perhaps ties into royalism and loyalism as well.
Well, that's very interesting because if we try to see a continuity between the War of Independence in Mexico and what is happening now, just a few days ago, I saw all the adjectives that were ascribed to Miguel Hidalgo. See, when he was condemned for his rebellion. And I say, wow, it's something like 40 adjectives or 35, something like that. Many of those adjectives are the ones that people, the economic elites, are directing right now against the President López Obrador. I say, wow, what a coincidence. There is a continuity there between the economic elites that consummated the independence in 1821 and then what is happening now in Mexico. I see that, well, unless you can illustrate me a little bit about that, you see that contrast or difference. That's my point. Thank you.
So, Eric, I was thinking that you had a lot of images on the different projections of, so we can maybe talk about that too.
There it is. And for some reason, I couldn't unsilence myself. I think the question about loyalism and royalism being managed democracy, I think is an excellent question because I do think, well, I think that loyalism, there is something to loyalism that has to do with belief in the balanced British Constitution and the fear of a more democratic constitution, which would obviously be not harmonious and not balanced. And the idea that monarchy could process representative government elections, etc., and water them down or pacify them, I think is something that is present in both the Iturbide vision, not only of Iturbide, but of the Iturbidistas, and the imperialists who are going to support Maximilian in the 1860s. So this idea of putting politics on hold, freezing politics. But I would also say that the way representative government is constructed in the early days of the Republic is an effort to manage democracy, and that's why you have indirect elections. You know? And as to the very interesting comments of Caitlin about how when democracy is introduced is because people are not scared because they've seen that once the people out of doors are brought into the citizenship fold, and it really does not make that much of a difference. And I would say the 1856-57 Congress is kind of the same thing. There is a lot of insistence on democracy. The vote is given to practically every male citizen who has a good, honest character. But despite the efforts of men like Zarco, of men like Ignacio Ramirez, elections are kept indirect. No, so it is a way to manage democracy. So even Democrats want to keep it within bounds that will allow order, that will keep the sovereign people within limits. So that I think in the case of the French intervention, which is the product of exceptional circumstances, of which a key element is the U.S. Civil War. No U.S. Civil War, no idea by Napoleon III that his dream of reestablishing French presence on the American continent could work, and to have a inter-oceanic channel, and that it doesn't need to be in Panama or in Nicaragua, that it could be in the Tehuantepec isthmus. If the Americans had not been absorbed by the U.S. Civil War, he wouldn't have gone on with the project. So once again, all these connections that in this case not intentional, but a central part of Mexican and American history. And I do think that monarchists in the 1860s, especially those that come from the conservative rejection of a constitution that does not take the true religion as one of the pillars of the democracy, there is this idea of taming democracy, but what they mean by taming democracy is taking its teeth out, and ensuring that there's this wonderful line by one newspaper, which is called La Razón, says, Mexicans can be anything they want except emperor. So you would have the emperor as a stable head of state, and then you could have elections and representative governments, but things wouldn't change that much. And that, I think, would be the definition of taking the teeth out of democracy. People will participate, people will vote, but things will not really change. And maybe we can go to Caitlin, and I can show you the images of Hidalgo afterwards, or as you wish.
We move to Caitlin, and then we can go back to the image.
Okay.
Well, I'm not sure I have too much to add on that particular point. I mean, I'll just say there's real resonances for me in that question of democracy and how you tame democracy to make it popular and palatable. Like in the 1790s in the US, democracy, a lot of pro-democratic radicals were very anti-slavery and were talking about much more direct elections. And it's only when the Jeffersonians come in and appropriate the language of democracy while also taking out a lot of the teeth of anti-slavery and direct democracy. It's only at that point that democracy becomes popular, once Jeffersonians have kind of transformed the meaning of it. I guess on the other, Marcel, you asked about kind of national identity and commemorations. And so in a way that brings us full circle to this question of founding moments and which founding moment we celebrate and what that signifies. Like, what's the difference between celebrating 1810 versus 1821 for Mexican history, or for US history? What's the difference between celebrating 1619 or 1776 or 1789? And I think where the way I see it, national identity, right? it's like there's a lot of founding moments. Well, there's a lot of different pieces of national identity. There's not one identity. What unites us is this history, right? This messy, complicated history. And so I think when we kind of remember this or commemorate it in Mexico, in the United States, it's not about, I mean, often I think, as Erica said, like the reason for kind of public history is to celebrate and create a sense of community. I think ideally that happens without necessarily feeling like you have to convince people to either love the country or hate it, or, you know, like, because the best history is not when you go into it with the, I guess if you go into history trying to make people love the United States or hate the United States, it's probably missing a lot of pieces to the story. And I'm thinking here of what my colleague, Daniel Immerwahr, has written about the way we teach history and the way it's often debated in the public sphere. Like, the point of teaching history isn't to get people to love the United States or Mexico or to hate it. It's just to get them to understand it. So it's like, if you're a math teacher and you teach the Pythagorean theorem, you're not trying to teach your students to love or hate Pythagoras. You're just trying to teach them how to understand triangles. This is my colleague's example. And so I think it's the same thing with the United States. The reason we have to learn this is, for better or for worse, that's our history. And so we have to take all of those pieces and kind of incorporate all of them as parts of our, as founding moments. So I don't know. So maybe that ties into Erica's images about how, of the sort of popular memory of Mexican independence. I don't know, maybe do we want to go to the images?
No, and adding to that, I think this is very good. No, you don't learn math because it's going to make you feel good about yourself and to love numbers or to hate numbers on the principles that they're prime or not prime. No? But also, I think, and I think that this probably has more to do with what you'll talk about tomorrow, is that the way we imagine these heroes has much more to do with the moment and who is doing the imagining than historical reality. I might want to put a lot of quotes around that word that tend to flatten out historical reality. So I'm going to show you some images of Hidalgo that were done at different moments, and I think that they tell us more. The gentleman who said that he feels that the adjectives, you can see it now, right? The adjectives used are very similar to those that are used by López Obrador. López Obrador feels the same, so that I think that one of the things that we need to understand about the adjectives used for Hidalgo is that Hidalgo was processed as a rebel, and he was, and I'm probably gonna murder this word in English, he was deconsecrated. No, he was a priest, and the sacrament was reversed in order for him to be condemned. So this is not just judging and processing and indicting a dissident. It was removing the sacred character of this man. So the image, the thing is, now I don't know, the image you see, this image, I see it on my right, but I don't know if you see it on your right, is a reproduction that Linati, Claudio Linati, who was an Italian artist, did of Hidalgo in the 1830s. No, so he is obviously a romantic character. The fact that he's a priest is clearly, or at least profoundly religious, that that religion is at the center of his struggle is obvious in the crucifix that he holds in his hand. He has the tricolor feathers in his cap. No, a very romantic a very romantic figure in this image of Hidalgo that is made for a European audience that wants to see what Mexicans look like, what they dress like, etc., etc. On the other side, there is a painting done in the very early 20th century by a fashionable painter at the time, Antonio Fabre. It's oil painting from 1903, where again you have this very romantic figure with the Virgin of Guadalupe as his standard, the hat, the high boots, no, this very dashing. You want to show the heroism and not necessarily the political project behind the Hidalgo struggle. This is a not very good reproduction of the portrait painted by Joaquin Ramirez in 1865. I think this is especially interesting. This was one of the many pictures that Maximilian had done because he wanted a gallery of national heroes. No, Maximilian and the men who are collaborating with him are imagining a Mexican history as one that is made up by heroes and almost no villains. No, so there's the insurgents, there's also Iturbide, there's some of Maximilian's Habsburg ancestors. No, and here you have an Hidalgo that looks much older, that is in his office, no, where there's these symbols of modernity, like the clock, and he is pointing to a piece of paper where there is obviously written down the project of independence. No? So this, I think, is the image that we have of Hidalgo. No? It's the one that's on the money, and the idea is that this father of the country, the real father of the country, so he's mature, is thought of independence, no? Before he went out and called forth the members of the pueblo who would follow him in his quest for liberty and independence. And finally, there's this fabulous representation of Hidalgo by Jose Clemente Orozco, which is in the Palace of Government in Guadalajara, where Hidalgo is, carrying the fire of emancipation against symbols of power, authority, but also of the ways people have thought of how society should be organized throughout history. So you have the crucifix, but you also have the sickle and the communist sickle and hammer. You also have the Nazi symbol. So that I think that these images show us not Hidalgo, but the ways we have reinvented Hidalgo to say different things at different points in time. And I think that history, so when historians look back on these sources, they will know more about the moment and the actors that generated these images than they will about Hidalgo. And I think that as academic historians, we do need to do exactly what Caitlin said. We need to not to glorify the past, not to condemn the past, but to explain what happened.
Getting close to time, there's 2 questions there from students, so maybe just
I don't be respectful of the program's time. So more than anything, my name is Juan Carlos. I'm a first generation millennial. I was looking to start a family in the near future, and these conversations about teaching and history is particularly fascinating given the conversations that are happening around curriculum at like the state and like local level among school boards, with CRT being constantly thrown around. So more than anything, I would just want like your thoughts on the current conversation with curriculum, because you know, I'm pursuing my master's. I consider myself fairly educated, but a lot of this history that I had to learn was in my later years in life versus my early years in life, because my curriculum at the time didn't teach me this. And I would really want the curriculum in the future to reflect that changing environment and to be able to learn, you know, not even glorify it, just learn about it. So I just want to see your thoughts more than anything as like educators. What exactly do you feel like the role of an educator is in learning about the history for those who don't know it?
So I want to step back and also ask about the people who are living this reality day to day. Specifically, I want to look at the aftermath of the Mexican-American War. All those Mexicanos across the territories that were lost, seized, what have you. Those Mexicans, you know, they're navigating their former Mexican nationality or their ongoing Mexican identity, and then their statelessness. I'm just wondering, how did they continue to, how did these Mexicans continue to celebrate, call back to this revolutionary heritage? Did we see federal and state authorities in the US try to repress or censor this as a way to prevent these people from potentially even rising up? Because again, the memory of the revolution was very recent. You know, was there ever a point where state and federal authorities were concerned these people might actually rebel and try to go back to Mexico? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
Well, thank you for both of those fantastic questions. The second one, boy, you're making me think I need to do more research because it's such a wonderful question. I mean, the way I usually think about it is that was one of the reasons that US slaveholders often opposed the all Mexico movement. The push to add all of Mexico was because they were afraid of precisely that, of what would happen to these Mexicans incorporated into the United States as US citizens, especially at a moment where US citizenship itself was so contested along racial lines and varied so much from one state to another because of the federal system. So, I mean, you're asking essentially, how does that big picture debate actually play out on the ground? And I think that is a borderlands history that I don't know enough about. Erica, maybe you can, maybe you know more about this than I do for sure. I mean, the other interesting thing I would say is that that's also by 1848, the US becomes a much less Protestant country between the influx of Irish immigrants and between the Mexicans who now are part of the United States. Not answering your question, but just I think another interesting point of connection. And then as to that wonderful question about teaching and curriculum, you know, it's interesting because I think that sometimes the ways that school boards or state legislatures approach K-12 history instruction is precisely what Erica and I were saying don't do, right? Like they'll dip into the past for examples that are supposed to make us feel patriotic or that are supposed to make us feel inspired towards one end or another. And those, I think, feeling patriotic, feeling inspired, sometimes we do feel that way from reading history because there are beautiful moments in our history. There are tragic moments in our history. So yes, you can find those moments, but I think what's different about the way school boards and legislatures, state legislatures sometimes approach history is they're dipping into history to find these narratives to serve those purposes of fostering patriotism or inspiration. Whereas I think historians are looking at the past just to explain what happened. And along the way, if you feel inspired or you feel ashamed or you feel patriotic, that's sort of the side product. And so I think I appreciate that K-12 educators are operating in a very different environment. I mean, history is politics, right? The way we teach history is profoundly political. And as a college instructor at a private institution, to be honest, I can kind of teach whatever I want, and whatever I think is most important. And so I say this not as with an understanding that what K-12 educators are doing is really difficult. And also, I think that this debate about critical race theory is really concerning precisely because if teachers feel like there are certain truths in history that they now can't talk about for fear of being targeted as violating some of these new state laws that say you can't talk about these things, what does it mean to pass a law that says you can't teach this part of history? People aren't disputing even so much that part of history happened, it's just you can't talk about it. And I think that's really alarming. And so what I think one of the roles that that historians at universities can serve, maybe is by continuing to tell those stories and to have the backs of the K-12 teachers who are in the classrooms telling these stories when they're worried they could get in trouble just for speaking the truth.
Response, and I think we're a little bit over time, but Erika, would you like to add into one of the questions?
Well, very, very briefly, because Caitlin's answers were wonderful about the Mexicans who stayed on the other side. Obviously, very diverse experiences. In general, the experience of dispossession of land, I think, shapes the experience of these Mexican American communities, but also the fact that these men and women became U.S. citizens following the same pattern as other acquired territories such as Florida and Louisiana, does open the space for political activism. And I'm just going to mention very, very quickly the fact that they don't celebrate usually September the 16th, but they will celebrate in California May the 5th. David Hayes Bautista has this very interesting book on May the 5th celebrations. And in LA and in Santa Barbara, Californians were celebrating the defeat of the French army by the Mexican army since 1862, which basically means that they've celebrated the 5th of May more often, more times than in Mexico City, where you didn't have 5th of May celebrations during the empire. So that I think is a really interesting thing about how these Californians are thinking about themselves and what their Mexican Hispanic legacy means in terms of citizenship, democratic participation, etc. I think that one of the things that we really need to think about as historians is our first, and as educators, not as historians, is that history should be interesting and history should be meaningful. The best thing I think we can hear is, boy, what you said really made me think. And that kind of puts the whole patriotism debate on the side. But I think that it's very foreign to how people, regular people, parents, think about what history should do. We still think history should create a national identity, should create principles of citizenship, etc. And I think history should be fascinating and interesting and provocative. And I don't know how we can make that switch. But that's if I were queen of the world, that's what I would like education, K through 12 history education to look like.
Well, and on that note, thank you so much, Caitlin Fitz and Erika Pani. This was a wonderful conversation. And thank you so much for both for connecting virtually. And thank you so much, the audience, for coming. There's going to be refreshments and a cooking class of tinga. So, so please feel free to come. Thank you so much.